Welcome back. Today's lesson is looking at commercial Gerber production. We're going to focus on potted Gerber production. And the photo that's on this cover slide is from one of the biggest Gerbera growers in the Niagara region. It's Orchard Park growers. They're located in the Jordan area. Good company. Sometimes there's openings. I would say it's one of those companies that's worth pursuing if there's an opportunity. They don't just grow Gerberas, they do Mandevilla, and mainly the two, Dipladenia, I guess, which is kind of Mandevilla. But anyways, as you may note, I've got a little thing here that this is adapted from Bob Croft of Cicada Seeds. Bob's probably knows a heck of a lot more about Gerbera crop production than most. Cicada Seeds is one of the biggest breeders for Gerberas, so that's why I'm using Bob's slides, and they were used by previous instructors in this course. I will mention that I myself have grown Gerberas commercially. I was a competitor to Orchard Park in the early days. I supplied potted Gerberas to a few of the Greenhouse Canada conventions for Cicada Seeds. So anyways, I like the crop. It's a challenging crop, but you'll see as we go through this that there's a lot of little tricks to producing a quality Gerbera crop. So let's get on with it. Probably for every different crop we talk about in this course, and I think I've been consistent in saying this, when you want to learn how to grow a crop, you should go back to where the crop came from. Now, a lot of the plants that we are growing have been heavily bred and selected for different traits, but at the very core, the plants are still very tightly related to their original context. So they're expecting certain things in how they grow in order to succeed. And so with Gerberas, they grow in places like South Africa, Madagascar, and parts of Asia. And they tend to grow in grasslands. So in mountainous valleys, you sort of have the grassy areas that creep up the sides of the hills where the water is flowing over it quickly. There's good drainage, shallower soil, well drained basically. And that's the context that Gerbers are looking for. And what I really want to highlight here is excellent drainage. I mean, a lot of crops need excellent drainage, but with Gerberas, this is definitely the case. Their roots need oxygen. They don't want to be sitting in water at all. Now, starting Gerberas, you have a couple of options. You start from seed or you start from tissue culture. Now, Gerbera seed is challenging. Gerbera is closely related to dandelions, not as closely in the sense that they are as vigorous and pervasive as dandelions, but they're very similar species. And their seeds are very similar, right? So these are achene seeds that have a attached, not necessarily a wing, but a modified wing, which is like a feather. These seeds are a bit of a pain to work with. They're oblong, they're light, and they have to sort of lay down in the soil and have the proper moistures in order to germinate. So you definitely need a decent seeding machine in order to seed lots of these. And they're small, so the density is over 7,000 seeds per 250 grams. So they're large, but light and clumsy, I'm gonna say. Oblong seeds are always a pain to work with. Nice little round pelletized seeds, piece of cake. As with most seeds, up to a year is okay, and after that you start seeing germination rates drop off. 5 degrees Celsius is sort of the typical, your fridge is just fine for storing seeds. And obviously not too moist, or you're going to end up with mold setting in on the seeds. So, 30% relative humidity is pretty dry. For starting off Gerbera seeds, typically you want the most porous media you can find. So if you look at how big the strands are in this sphagnum moss that they're seeding in, that gives you an idea of how coarse we're talking about. We do not look at a normal seedling mix for this. I have seen some people mix sand in, but I think long strand fiber seems to be just fine with the addition of extra perlite. So everything possible to increase drainage. Basically, what we're trying to do with these seedlings is, as soon as the true leaves show up, we need to be able to have high leaf transpiration. So we need to create a fairly low vapor pressure deficit, so that, I mean, high vapor pressure deficit, so that we're pulling water through those seedlings to get nutrients to the growing tips. We'll talk more about that as we go, but getting the nutrients to the tips of the meristem and the blades is a bit of a challenge with the Gerbera. And by having good leaf transpiration, we can assure that we're going to get things like boron to the tip of the meristem, so we have proper development. So we want to have porous media so we can irrigate frequently and have good transpiration rates. This slide is just showing you a comparison between the long fiber mix on this side with the standard seedling mix over here. Unlike, actually all plants are pretty much the same. And again, I've talked about this before. Your crop starts off with this potential, and its maximum yield or quality is achieved towards the finishing date. And the mistakes you make early on have a bigger impact on the trajectory of the quality of your finished state. That could be yield, or the size of flowers, or the color of the flowers, the number of flowers. So it's important that we don't make mistakes in the early stages, because they have the biggest impact on that trajectory. So looking at this tray on the right, we can see that there is a lot of inconsistency here. We've got, ungerminated, we've got small, we've got large, small, small, large. It's very inconsistent. So it's absolutely critical that we get the right media. So we need high porosity media to get, prevent some of these deformed, what we call gnarled or stunted seedlings. Gerbera seedlings are really, really weird. Actually, even in tissue culture, they pop up in all sorts of uneven ways. And unevenness is going to be the theme of the story here today, because Gerberas, they're getting better as they breed them, but they are historically difficult to produce a consistent crop with. And to this day, this is still an issue, right? So what happens is, when we would plant out a bench of Gerbera, as they grew, we would constantly have to sort the pots, and we would sort the ones that were larger and closer to being finished at the front of the bench. And so the staff are in there moving pots constantly, which is, contributes to costs, but it allows you to have a better gauge of how many pots are going to be ready to ship at any one time. You can't just say, well, I planted a whole bench, and you look at it, and at first it might look like the whole bench is wonderful. And when you start to pack, you realize that half the pots are undersized and you can't use them. And by the time you've picked and choose, half the bench is empty. So with Gerberas, we often spend a fair amount of time sorting the Gerberas. I'm going to talk about this more later, but while it's on my mind, you can order Gerbera as assorted or single color. And typically, if you order single colors, they are more consistent. So you're actually better off to order a whole bench of yellow and a whole bench of orange and a whole bench of pink or red, and then choose how you're shipping from those. You'll have less labor. But, oftentimes if you have limited space, you can say, I'm going to order an assorted color because I don't know what the customer wants, and we'll just pick and choose what colors they request. That's a lot more running around. So just sort of stuff to think about in terms of growing a Gerbera crop. Looking at an 8-week-old Gerbera plug, you can see not only is this much more vigorous and large in the core strand, there's still some inconsistencies. You can see some soil, you see small ones mixed in here, gaps. It's not nearly the kind of vigorous growth that we see on the left side with the long strand. So just reinforcing that, high aeration, good drainage is critical for quick growth. And just zooming in on 128 cell plugs, they're, decent size. You can see the difference between the two. Look at the root formation on the course. The roots are, they're able to penetrate into the soil because there's good oxygen. Over here, where it's too wet, the roots are not penetrating. We're seeing reduced root growth. It's just aerobic in some parts because they're probably too wet. So again, repetition being the best teacher compensates for my inabilities here with this online stuff. Long fiber, again, lots of air cavities so that you have, you've got good transpiration happening. And you kind of want a combination of dry spots of the day towards the end of the day to encourage new root growth so that the next day you've got fresh root hairs and root tips to have maximum nutrient uptake. And of course, calcium and boron are what we call passive nutrients. They're passively taken up by the plant. What that means is that at the root level, down here at the root hair, instead of taking a molecule called ATP, which is an energy molecule, to run a pump which actively pumps in a nutrient like nitrate, right? These nutrients. Oh, I erased my root by accident. Oh, nuts. Anyways, things like calcium and boron are only taken up as water is moving in the root. So they sort of hitch a ride through those channels with the water. And these two nutrients with Gerberas are especially critical for healthy leaves and proper floral development. They're obviously always important, but some crops more so than others. And things like lettuce and Gerbera, these are definitely critical, especially calcium. But they're definitely important for all, and it's consistent that across all plants, calcium and boron are passively taken up at the root cap. So having excellent water flow through the roots is how you're going to assure that you have enough calcium and boron. So we want high transpiration rates. I've repeated myself lots of times here, so I expect you to remember that when I asked you on the midterm, right? And of course, higher aeration, then that means that we're getting root growth as well as leaf growth and good micronutrient and macronutrient. I guess you want to go calcium's in the middle. Good nutrient uptake. So just to give you a picture, they say a picture is 1,000 words. So on which side is your high porosity? Perhaps you could guess. The one on the right. So what we see here is we've got more flowers, we've got better foliage development, denser, and on the low drainage, the wetter pot, we've got smaller underformed leaves and fewer flowers and poor coloring. So just to emphasize that not only at the plug stage, but going right through to finishing high porosity media is critical. Summarizing germination, this slide does a good job of it. Temperatures are there. We're talking about uniform moisture being absolutely critical. Oftentimes vermiculite is used to cover the seeds. That creates a microclimate that keeps the moisture levels more consistent, so you don't have air currents drying out parts of the trays. We'll talk a little bit about that coming up in some other slides. Sometimes high pressure sodium light is used over the propagation bay, fluorescent lighting, but in more recent years, actually LEDs. This is one area where LEDs do a fantastic job, and that's in propagation. The spectrum control allows us to enhance rooting and control stretch. So we've talked about that in other classes. Something to note that, we're looking at around 21 to 23 degrees Celsius. Temperature is pretty critical, and it needs to be fairly consistent. Where if you get too cold or too hot, we're talking just outside this range, right? So these are kind of hard stops. If you go outside these ranges, that actually inhibits germination. So yeah, it is like a Goldilocks thing, which is kind of annoying. Gerberas are especially Goldilocks crops. Not too hot, not too cold, just like the bear's porridge. Do you remember that story? Yeah, come on. So if you cover the seed with media, that also inhibits. So we need some light infiltration, right? So that's where the vermiculite, a light coating, allows some light through, but allows for a microclimate. Um, Interestingly, incandescent light, which is high in infrared, inhibits germination. So it's not enough to drive photosynthesis, but the IR component will shift the plant away from germination. So remember, it's a balance between red and far red, and that's how the plant determines how deep it is in the soil. So if you use only incandescent light, it's going to think that it's too far down in the soil and it won't risk germination. So we need enough light that the seed knows that, okay, yeah, no, I'm near the surface. This is good. I can germinate. Yeah. And of course, temperature nights that are reversed is also not, good, but that's unusual. Warm night. I mean, if you're diffing seedling areas, that's a bit odd. Lots of words in this slide, but essentially what I'm trying to highlight here is if you look, this is covered with a cloth. It's sometimes known in Holland as Ramée cloth. I call it frost cloth. It's kind of a loose polyester weave. So if you put it up against your mouth, you can breathe through it, but it's kind of got a hazy white look to it. So it's perfect for letting moisture and gases through, but blocks enough light and keeps enough of a microclimate underneath that it's really effective at maintaining, fairly high humidity, but allowing for gas exchange, which is critical for good germination. So if you do this, you don't necessarily have to use vermiculite, right? I got a lot of marking all over here. So this cloth, let me move on. This is what frost cloth looks like in the context of, raised bed gardening. It's used all over the place in horticulture, to be honest. It's very, very useful. Um, in this context here, what we have here is we have Ramée cloth or frost cloth, and then covered by tenting. This is done by a number of ornamental growers in the Niagara region for seeding and propagating. If you look carefully, I wish I had a zoomed in look, but I think if you look at these trays, you'll see that there's kind of a milky film over top the cloth. And that's what happens when you stretch the frost cloth over the trays and then lightly water it. It kind of mats down to the tray and it just locks in and maintains good humidity. But allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass through it. So very, very useful material for seedlings that require decent humidity. Now, in the context of Gerberas, technically speaking, you wouldn't necessarily be tenting because that's going to block too much light. I brought this up just because at this point it's helpful for you to see again how this works. So once you've got some germination happening, it's pretty quick, about a week. Your cotyledons are up. Then you can start to dry down your trays between waterings. So instead of maintaining constant humidity like we were doing when we're trying to initiate germination, then we're going to start letting the moisture fluctuate during the day. So let it dry down a little bit before we water again. And sort of unusual, a very low fertilizer dose. Partly because the cotyledons on the Gerbera seeds are fairly small. So there's not a lot of reserve nutrients in those cotyledons. So by applying a light fertilizer dose when you're irrigating, it might compensate for any leaching and also just make sure that there's nothing, the plants are not in need of anything at any one time. So temperatures are still pretty consistent around the same 21, no lower than 21, no more than 24. Now, when we get to the plug stage, right, where the plants are starting to grow true leaves, it's important that we rinse the foliage after every feed with clear water. This is because the leaves of Gerberas are very delicate. They have very thin cell wall. And when you feed with top irrigation, the nutrient solution, the salt, will actually accumulate as the water evaporates and increase in concentration, and you'll get edge burn. And we don't want that because these leaves are going to expand probably about 20 times the size they currently are. And any deformation that happens now will greatly impact the quality of the leaf later. So it's really critical that when you are fertigating these at the plug stage, you need two systems of irrigation. Often the farm has two parallel water lines, one with feed and one clear water. So they'll give a feed shot and then they'll follow it with a clear water shot to wash off the leaves. Um, as far as light goes, we're looking at 150 micromoles, not crazy bright for fairly long days. So now under anything over 150 micromoles, you would then shade. Remember, these are mountainous crops. They're not looking at, super bright skies. There's, in the clouds, good drainage. So they're not a massively, sun hungry crop, let's say. So again, rinsing off the leaves after feeding is critical to prevent salt burn. When your plugs start to get big, you see how the leaves are starting to sort of interact with each other. These are pretty dense. So we're at what we call 4 true leaf stage. This is where things get critical. With Gerberas, more than just about any other crop that I know of, you have to transplant them at the correct stage. And earlier is better than later, right? You definitely want to, and as the slide said, whoops, let me erase that. As the slide says, the goal here is to avoid a root-bound plug. Um, so we got to make sure we don't overgrow them. I got another picture here. Not so much root-bound, but see how if you look at these roots, they have a little bit of a tap. And if that root hits the bottom of the plug and starts to wrap around, then we have a problem. So you want to transplant before that happens. And that way you don't end up with uneven crop growth. Um, Going back briefly to germination, as with all things, fungus gnats are a problem, but they do seem to like the Gerbera seed. They actually will chew on the cotyledons for nutrients. So it's really important that you use a clean situation, clean media, absolutely sterilize your trays. Make sure that there's underneath the benches is perfectly clean and sterile, that there's no breeding grounds for fungus gnats. That means no piles of soil in the ground, no weeds, no wet spots. Um, Sometimes you can't avoid wet spots under greenhouse benches, but you can drench them with some insecticide. Old school farmers would dust lime under the bench, and lime being natural is not like a toxic chemical, but what it does is it raises the alkalinity of the soil such that the fungus gnat larvae can't germinate. It also inhibits weed seeds. So that's an old school technique. I haven't seen that done in a long time, but it does work. And while we're at the slide, you might as well observe that this is a horrible seeded tray here. So you can see this tray has been attacked by fungus gnats. All these seeds that didn't germinate, the cotyledons were attacked by fungus gnats. And the ones where the fungus gnats didn't go, they actually managed to germinate. That's a really crazy line. Another challenge with Gerberas, like I said, this is a challenging crop. You absolutely need uniform irrigation. So when you get distorted, this is a distorted plug. You can see the leaves are kind of puckered and curled on the sides. They have a mottled surface. These types of seedlings are indications of overwatering. So this tray, here we don't even have good germination. Here we have no germination. We've got overwatering here, looks like it here. Even signs of some damage on this plant. This person has some serious mechanical issues with their propagation bench. Maybe they're hand watering, which is not ideal. Professional propagators use boom irrigation because you get absolute uniformity. Overhead hanging misters like we have at the college is an inexpensive method of propagating, but it is far from professional grade. We now have a boom, which you'll hopefully learn to operate this winter. I know you will. That's, by the way, an excellent skill to have, so make sure you take the time to force Matt to show you how to use it. If not during your crops class, any other class. I haven't used it yet myself, so maybe we can all learn how to use the darn thing. But these are Zwartz booms, which are very popular in the ornamental industry, and if you can learn how to operate it, that's a phenomenal thing to put on your resume. Because you're constantly adjusting them, how fast they move, what nozzles you're using, how to control. You can actually control different irrigation times for different sections of the bench. So how do you do that? That kind of stuff. Um, Talking about fertilizer, again, we have talked about this so many times, but once again, nitrate-based fertilizers have different effects than ammonium-based fertilizers. So with Gerberas, the nitrate gives us smaller, denser leaves, and less shading of neighboring crowns. We don't want that. Shading your neighboring crown is not a good thing. So we want to control leaf expansion. If you use the 20-20-20 fertilizer that has quite a bit of ammonium in it, you're going to get massive leaf expansion. They're going to spread out over the neighboring plants and wreak havoc. Because when you shade your neighboring plant or the crown of your neighboring plant, you get fewer flowers. That's bad news. Quickly talking about the fertilizers for Gerberas. Um, This is an excellent fertilizer mix. In fact, a lot of growers have been switching to this kind of fertilizer mix over the 28-20, 14-0-14 sort of alternating combination that we talked about in the fall. A 15-5-15, what they call a Cal Mag Special, is a great all-around fertilizer for many crops. It has some ammonium in it, right? And it has the majority in the nitrate form. And that having some ammonia means that we're also going to make sure that we end up with the right pH in the root zone. If we had only nitrate, our pH in the root zone would just climb and climb and climb, right? Because it's producing hydroxyls. So we need some ammonium, right, to get the protons to make the soil acidic. So you can't really get rid of all of it. In hydroponics, for example, where we eliminate a lot of it, we have to usually add acid, all right? And you don't often see ornamental growers breaking out the acid. So what they do is they manage the root zone by using these sort of fertilizers. Ornamental is different from vegetables. If you want to talk to me about that in class, do so. But in this context, ornamental, ammonium, we're going to use some. This is what we call a complete peat light mix. So it has your NPK. It's got calcium and magnesium and micronutrients. It is a complete package. It's the whole deal. You can grow great crops with this stuff. If you're short on cash and you want to buy a professional fertilizer to grow your crops at home and have excellent yields and good flowers, this is the best all-round compromise. Yes, it doesn't have as much potassium for your flowering stage. There are some that have slightly elevated potassium and slightly lower nitrogen for the flowering stage. Those can be purchased as well. But again, like I said, if you have an all-round, you want a single all-round fertilizer that just you can't afford, $65 or $70 for per bag, and you want to just buy one bag, this is the one to buy. As far as nitrogen is concerned, more is not necessarily better. And this is universal across all crops, right? You can keep adding and adding and adding, and eventually it starts to go in the wrong direction. So here, between 100 and 200 ppm nitrogen, we see our optimal growth. So these are the ranges that you would oscillate between, depending on weather, sunlight, that kind of thing. You wouldn't want to go higher, and you wouldn't want to go lower. Once your crop is in full transplant in your pot, just expanding and growing. Now, some common deficiencies. Magnesium is absolutely common. So it's a mobile element, right? Review some of this stuff, right? Which means that your older leaves are going to show interveinal chlorosis. So the new leaves look good here, but there's these older leaves are looking kind of chlorotic. So that's the key here. Now, remember the previous slide, there's magnesium in there. But otherwise, you would source your magnesium as adding Epsom salts, right? So your magnesium sulfate. Typically, farmers throw a little Epsom salts in the fertilizer every once in a while just to make sure there's that extra little bit of magnesium. But remember, you can't overdo it. It starts to interfere with calcium these two nutrients are antagonistic, right? And typically it's 3-to-1 for calcium to magnesium. So you don't want to overdo that Epsom salt thing. They are also what we call an iron inefficient plant. So some plants are iron inefficient. And that means that you have to sort of baby them to make sure they don't run out of iron. Now, iron is an immobile element, right? Which means it's going to present on the young leaves at the top. So here we see the entire upper crown is showing intervenoclerosis. That is an iron deficiency. And it's almost always related to pH, right? Anything over 6.2, you're going to start seeing problems with Gerberas. So 5.8 is the ideal pH. And also EDDHA is the preferred chelate form, not EDTA, as we've discussed before, mainly because it is more effective at the higher pH levels, unlike hydroponics where we typically are in lower pH levels. Now, 2177, this is a fertilizer you can use if you're trying to impact the pH of your media. So let's say you're a Gerbera grower, you got your 15-5-15 CalMag special, and you're doing your weekly EC and pH meter monitoring of your root zone, and you see that the pH in the root zone is creeping up. What you would do is you would rotate in one feed of 2177, and then wait a couple of days and recheck your pH in your root zone. And what you should see is that the pH has gone down again, and then you'd switch back to your 15-5-15. So this is an acid-producing fertilizer. It doesn't mean you start switching to it and using 2177 every day. It's just give it a pulse, give it a couple of days, and then check the pH and see where you're at. Interestingly, like a lot of crops, and I spent a lot of time trying to re-emphasize this, manganese as a nutrient is more often toxic to plants than beneficial. Now, we need manganese, but I find more often than not, it is in an oversupply situation. And if you see purple spots on your lower leaves, regardless of what you're growing, by the way, I've seen this in cannabis. I think I've mentioned this before. You're oversupplying your micronutrients, and likely manganese in particular is giving you toxicity. So dark purple spots in your lower foliage is a sign of manganese toxicity. Now, if you don't fix it, eventually these spots get bigger and they start to become necrotic. And then on the edges, you see necrosis and purpling, and then the plant just weakens. It won't necessarily kill it, but it will weaken tremendously. Boron is another really interesting nutrient for Gerbera. We've talked about this before with poinsettias, but with Gerbera, it particularly has a big impact. If you see that the leaves are not expanding properly, that there's curling, excessive curling at the young leaf stage, you have a boron deficiency. But oftentimes it's very difficult to diagnose at that stage. So we typically have a constant supply of about 0.25 ppm for your crop to make sure that there is enough. Instead of just bumping up all your micronutrients, we add specifically boron. If you have insufficient boron and you go right through to finishing, you get what's called fasciation. You should remember that term for your midterm. That's where you've got two flowers that are fused, and the term means bundling or fusing. And if you can see, I hope you can see in this picture here, this is actually three stems fused into one. So you can see there's a bit of a rib here and a rib here. It's not the easiest to see. In this flower down here, the stem would be fused. So if you cut the stem on, it would look like two kind of joined at the hip. So that's fasciation. And boron, insufficient boron is often the key indicator or the key cause for fasciation. Not always. Sometimes extreme environmental fluctuation, but boron is absolutely critical. Gerberas are especially sensitive to fasciation, so it's important to keep an eye on that. Now, temperature fluctuation will also do that. Remember, this is a Goldilocks crop. Everything's been nice and steady and no mistakes. You can see how it's a challenging crop. So once we're growing our larger plant, 20 to 21 degrees Celsius, not the plug stage, that's a bit warmer. We grow a little cooler, but for crops, that's still on the warmer side. You know, it's not like crazy warm, but so anywhere from 13 to 22 degrees Celsius is your growing range. And the growers use these temperatures to control unfolding rates, so leaf unfolding. So that's where the growers tracking the growth with charts, and they have ship dates for when the crop will be sold. And they have to try to gauge if the crop's too fast or too slow, and they adjust the daily average temperatures constantly to make sure they hit those ship dates. So now going above, you know, they can only speed the crop up so much. If you go warmer than 22, you actually, it actually delays flowering, and sometimes even get bud abortion. So it's important, you know, you can only speed it up so much. Yeah. So we're looking at, wow, 44 to 18 days on average with those temperatures. That's a pretty big fluctuation. But yeah, hotter than 22 is not going to change anything for you. So flowering response, this is just one variety, Gerbera Festival. These are day neutral, but they are facultative plants. Facultative, that means that supplemental lighting will enhance flowering or accelerate flowering somewhat. So this is where it's not a crazy amount of light. We're looking at 14 moles of light per day. That's not crazy considering tomatoes are 21, you know, so we're not, you know, you don't need massive amounts of light. Gerber growers are not always running their grow lights, you know, unless they're really pushing their crops. But, you know, if you can run the supplemental lighting, you might get an increase in the number of flowers. This is very variety dependent. And it's hard to really say definitively if it's necessary or not. I think it comes down to what varieties you're growing in as your facility. Is your greenhouse glass or is it poly? All sorts of other factors that go into that. It's important to note that Gerber flowers initiate fairly early on. You don't see them for a long time. So they initiate when there's 1 to 2 leaves that have unfolded from the seedling. Yeah, we're all the way back to the seedling. Remember where the leaves are starting to overlap the neighboring crowns? It's already at that point that we're concerned about the development of the flowers because they're starting to form. So typically that means we use large plug trays, right? So plug trays, that's back to our seedlings, that have large spacing. There's no point in being greedy. You're not going to use a 512 little seedling plug tray. That's just not going to work. We go with the bigger plugs if you want higher quality. If you're buying Gerber plugs and they come with tiny little plugs, I would say switch suppliers. Or if you have the option, buy the larger ones. If you pay a little bit more, I guarantee you, you'll have less shrinkage and you'll have a lower cost overall when you're done. So really important to remember that. So delaying transplant. So that's not that's transplanting after the root has hit the bottom of the plug and is starting to wrap around the bottom. If you delay past that stage or even to that stage, you end up with delayed flowering, uneven flowering, shorter stems, which means your flowers are buried in the leaves. That's not good. Smaller flowers. That's not good. Or even worse yet, bud abortion. Or split crowns. I got a slide coming up showing you what a split crown is. And then weaker plants. Well, weaker plants is a bit nebulous, but yeah. So as far as delayed planting, this is weeks past seeding. So this is only 8 weeks past seeding, and this is holding the plugs and waiting till longer. So this is 14 weeks after seeding. Look at the outcome, right? Like here, they're just beginning to form flowers, and these guys are already saleable. That's a whole month. You know, from a business perspective, that's a no-brainer. You know, you're definitely not going to do that. And at 14 weeks, this one may not even flower. It may just be a dud. And if it does flower, the flowers will be down in here, so it's not saleable. So that is definitely not the way to go. Some more pictures showing 8, 10, 12, and 14 weeks. You know, here we have sporadic flowering. See, there's a number of duds and some with only 2 flowers. Very, very poor sale quality here. These are kind of acceptable, and then these ones are all good. In fact, if you ask me, and from my perspective, I would say this is the ideal spot. The flower stems are a bit long on these. They would not meet quality standards for a lot of wholesalers. Uh, and those quality standards are practical because they're related to the flowers hitting the top of the box. You can imagine if this is in a box and it's being shipped in a truck, right? These flowers are going to be rubbing against the top of the box. And when they open the box at the destination, the petals will be scored and browned and damaged. So not acceptable. You got to make sure. Now, what I would have done, if you're running a business, you would do 8 weeks, but you would do a growth regulator application to keep the petioles short. In this case, B9. And I got a slide coming up for that. So you finished 2 weeks earlier, which from a cost of operation, that's 2 weeks or less of heat and into your crop and lighting energy. And that's easily offset by a single application of a growth regulator, which doesn't cost that much compared to, running electricity and gas. Now, as far as shading other seedlings and what that means, other than, uneven and delayed, this concept of splitting. So imagine one seedling is emerged and it's shading the others. Now, this is a theme we've seen many times. The far red is able to penetrate through and the red is not. So that has an effect on the growth of the other seedlings. It's going to cause them to want to stretch and not flower. Now, if you wait till a stage where there's 1 or 2 true leaves, you know that the flowers are starting to initiate. But if the plant gets a signal from far red that, no, we need more vegetative growth to be taller because we're being shaded, it will abort the flowers and then direct energy to the stem and the leaves to go tall quickly so it can outcompete for light. And it will flower way later and way less evenly. But at least in nature, in that sense, it has had a chance to flower as opposed to being choked out by another plant. So this is a compromise that the plant is making. But at the end of the day, from a grower's perspective, that's not useful to us. We have a serious problem if that's the case, right? So we have to make sure that we don't get far red light hitting our seedlings and causing unevenness. Now this is a normal crown. So the buds they're staggered in a cycle. So this is the oldest, the next, the third, and the least mature. It's a corkscrew. And this formed when there was just 1 or 2 true leaves on the plug, right? This formed a long time ago. So this plug has been growing normally. This is a normal crown. If we have shading, it actually splits into 2 stems. And it's like, think of it like this. This is before the buds have formed, right? So in the sense that the plant's like, okay, we're being shaded. I'm going to split the difference. I'm going to send 1 shoot up this way, and I'm going to shoot 1 up this way, and maybe 1 will make it. But from a wholesale quality perspective, each one is going to have fewer flowers and much smaller. But the plant is just taking its resources and making a gamble for survival. It doesn't care about your wholesale sales. So that's what's going on here, right? So again, shading of leaves over neighboring crowns is a no-no. As far as height control, aside from growth regulators, you can do a 0 diff, so your same day night temperature, and that will slow leaf expansion and reduce the stem stretch. Stem stretch in Gerbers is a big thing because they love to stretch their stems. That's often you see them as a cut flower with a nice long stem, right? That's fine for cuts, but in a pot, no, they're going to break or hit the box. The other thing which you've learned is a morning drop. This is about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius for 3 to 4 hours. It's pretty long. Depends on the time of year when you want to do this. But maybe 2 hours before sunset and 1 hour after. But that's a grower's choice to some extent because every facility is a little bit different. But there is the option of B9, which is a really soft growth regulator. You have to go through a fair amount, like 1,500 to 2,500 ppm. That works out to quite a bit. If you're filling a 100-liter tank, you're going to jug, half a bucket in there. But it's soft in the sense that it doesn't have a long-lasting effect. So it's like causing a temporary pause and then the plant continues growing again. So now we got to be careful. If you overdo it, you make a mistake in your calculation, you end up with the flowers blooming below the foliage. That's bad news. That means you've over applied your B9 or you've done it too many times. But typically, almost all Gerbera crops are sprayed once with B9, and that's about 3 to 4 weeks after germination, right? So roughly before the 1 month mark, you're going to spray those plug trays with B9. It seems early, you know, a little plug, but you know, it's important because that's right around when the flowers are starting to form. So we got to make sure we send the right signals to the crop. If like for any reason it wants to stretch, we're going to shut that down. So it's like, no, I'm committed to the flowers. I'm not stretching. So and then you can do a second application a week or two after that, after transplanting, and then typically you're done. I think if you do applications later than this, you have a problem. This is when you see the buds are just still sitting on the base of the crown, is your absolute last chance that you can spray and control stretch. If there's any kind of a stalk forming on the flowers, it's too late. You cannot do it. So let me ask, if you can't spray B9 anymore, what can you do to control that? And of course, you should be saying, well, Derek, we can use diff or morning drop, and you're correct. You can. So on the left is what happens when you apply B9 too late in a crop cycle. That's bad news. You're not going to sell that. Another important thing with Gerberas is the planting depth, and I've seen this a lot. When we had that our greenhouse, we had to really keep an eye on planting to make sure that people weren't just jamming the plugs deep into the pot, and then when they get watered, the soil levels off and washes into the crown and buries it. That can result in what's called blindness. That's where the crown is shaded by dirt and it aborts all the flowers, and you end up with a green plant that has no flowers. That's what blind means in the context of horticulture. But more typically, if it's too deep, you get delayed flowering or even malformed flowers. But typically with Gerberas, I think you're getting the sense that temperature has to be consistent, moisture has to be consistent, light levels have to be consistent, planting depth has to be consistent. I think the name of the game is consistent, partly because the crop is inherently uneven, and any minor mistake you make just exacerbates that unevenness. As far as common pests, I think this is the last slide. There's really not anything out of the ordinary, thrips, whitefly, leaf miner. I will highlight that whitefly is a major problem for Gerberas. And one I didn't put here is powdery mildew, PM. A lot of new genetics are resistant to powdery mildew, which is fantastic. It's still an issue. So like most crops that are sensitive to powdery mildew, you have to watch your temperature and relative humidity and make sure you don't end up with situations where you have cold temperatures and a spike in high humidity that allows condensation to form going into your evening. That's the critical time, right? Another one that is actually probably a bit unique to Gerberas and chrysanthemums primarily is leaf miner. I have seen this in cut Gerberas. A lot of cut Gerbera farmers have leaf miner. Lucky for them, they're not selling the leaves, but if they let it get out of control, it will hit the crop's yield. So they'll have fewer flowers and smaller flowers because energy is being eaten up by those bugs, right? Remember, a leaf miner, it's a flying insect that lays an egg in the leaf. That egg hatches, and the larva actually crawls around between the upper and lower epidermis and eats a big path, a winding path to the leaf. And it wipes out all sorts of mesophyll and eats up sugar reserves, and so there's less for the plant to use for growth. So there are biologicals that work, but you have to get on top of it early, and you got to buy lots of them to keep it under control. I forget what it's called. I'm not your IPM guy. I've forgotten about that one, but I'll let you look that up for yourself. Maybe I'll post it, but ask me again when we're in class. Drawing a blank. Um, I have not seen personally mites or broad mites on Gerberas, but in recent years there has been increasing levels of broad mites showing up in a lot of crops. I don't know why. It could be because we have such good control of mites with Persimmilus, right? That we're not spraying, and broad mites are easy to kill with agaricides, which are insecticides that target mites or spiders, essentially. Um, so by not spraying regularly, the broad mites now have less pressure on them, and they're becoming more of an issue where we really hardly ever saw them for years. Now, I'm not suggesting we go back to spraying. So broad mites, I think hypoaspis kind of works, but I have seen in quite a few situations where the grower just had to spray quickly for broad mites. They're easy to kill with an insecticide, but the problem is you're going to hurt your IPM program, your beneficials program, your bios for your two-spotted spider mite. So you need to have a strategy, right? So um, let's say you spray something like Avid, which is very potent against broad mites, but you end up with 6 weeks of toxicity in your leaves for your Persimmilus. It doesn't mean that the Persimmilus won't be effective at all. It means that if you release the Persimmilus, they're going to die on your leaves within half a day or a day. So oftentimes, if you have to go through this, you've had to make the tough decision. You would, buy maybe 2 or 3 times the normal amount of Persimmilus for, 3-4 weeks. And then once you're out of that window, go back to your normal dosage. Otherwise, you're going to have, cleaned up your broad mite and at the expense of having a massive explosion of two-spotted spider mite, which, they're both bad, really. But okay, I am so looking forward to coming back to campus because I'm having such a hard time motivating myself to do these video things. I feel like I'm just boring you to death. Anyways, that's Gerberas. They're a beautiful crop. They're fun to grow. And by the way, we're growing a crop ourselves at the college. Matt has the plug scheduled for delivery. Fingers crossed, we're planting them. That's how it was scheduled. I'm assuming we're coming back. Everything says we're coming back on the 25th. So, all right. Take care. Bye.